In 966 AD, the Fatimid Caliph's court physician in Damascus drafted an emergency directive: create a high-density, fat-saturated dough capable of keeping royal cavalry alive through 18-hour desert patrols without dropping their weapons. What social media algorithms currently market as a $100 viral luxury, a chocolate bar stuffed with crispy emerald-tinted threads, began as a cold calculation of caloric survival under military siege. In 2021, when Sarah Hamouda launched the fixed dessert chocolatier in Dubai, packaging this ancient dough inside heavy Belgian cocoa and edible leaf gold, the internet treated it as an aesthetic triumph born in a boutique kitchen. It was nothing of the sort. It was the reactivation of a 1,000-year-old logistics formula designed for war. Look at your own counter or inside your pantry right now. You assume the objects sitting there were engineered for your pleasure, crafted to satisfy a quiet evening craving. They were not. Most of what we consume was forged in the friction of territorial expansion, tax ledgers, and military blockade. Which everyday item sitting on your counter right now hides a trade war or a forgotten empire? Tell me in the comments so we can examine its ledger next. Because behind the glossy wrappers and algorithmically engineered trends lies a far darker history of human extraction. To understand how this ration reached your screen, you have to return to the scorching heat of 10th century Syria. The Fatimid Caliphate was pushing its borders against hostile terrain, and its mounted archers were dying of exhaustion long before reaching enemy lines. Standard bread rotted in the humidity of leather saddlebags within 48 hours. Meat turned rancid under the desert sun. Water supplies were limited by the weight of the skin canteens. The court physician, Abu Abdallah al-Tamimi, observed a fundamental physiological wall. A soldier in heavy-scale armor needed thousands of calories a day to maintain muscle control, but carrying heavy iron pots and raw wheat slowed troop movement to a crawl. Speed was the only tactical advantage the Caliphate possessed against desert raiders. Al-Tamimi did not look for flavor. He looked for stability, caloric density, and structural endurance. He took high-gluten wheat flour, mixed it with water into a loose liquid batter, and devised a technique to drip it through perforated copper spouts onto a scorching hot copper plate. The batter dried in seconds into microscopic, hair-like threads. These threads were immediately submerged in rendered sheep tail fat and pressed into dense, compact cakes that resisted moisture and spoilage. It smelled of scorched copper and hot animal fat. It was dry, portable, and virtually indestructible. A rider could break off a piece with one hand, swallow it while galloping, and receive enough energy to keep his horse at full speed through an 18-hour patrol. This was not pastry, it was fuel. In the administrative registers of Damascus, these dried wheat threads were calculated in the exact same column as iron arrowheads, horse feed, and gunpowder components. The state did not measure this substance in servings or tastes. They measured it in tonnage, field rations, and marching range per battalion. A military commander did not ask if the dough was pleasant. He asked how many leagues a cavalry unit could cover before the fat oxidized. For 2 centuries, this high-density ration sustained the garrisons that guarded the trade routes between North Africa and the Levant. When soldiers sat around campfires outside besieged city walls, they did not eat this dough with sugar or rosewater. They ate it mixed with clarified butter and salt, washing it down with stagnant well water before putting on their iron helmets. The luxury industry today sells you this exact same structural matrix, coated in green pistachios and milk chocolate, as an invention of modern indulgence. But strip away the synthetic green dye, the foil wrapping, and the digital hype, and you are left with the cold, functional architecture of medieval siege logistics. It was not an error, it was a calculation. And as the Fatimid power began to fracture under the weight of civil wars and external invasions, this military ration did not disappear into history. It moved directly into the hands of the next rising empire, where state auditors transformed a battlefield fuel into an instrument of ruthless taxation. In 1572, inside the damp stone archives of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, an imperial auditor dipped an iron reed pen into gall ink to draft Decree number 412. The Ottoman state was taking formal ownership of the flour threads. What had been an emergency cavalry ration under the desert sun was now rebranded, codified, and placed under strict imperial monopoly. The Sultan's treasury did not treat the dough as food. They treated it as a taxable commodity, subject to the same rigorous customs audits as gunpowder, raw timber, and saltpeter. The Guild of Kadayif makers in Istanbul was placed under direct court supervision. A baker could no longer operate an independent hearth. To light a fire under a drying pan, he required 3 separate state permits, a license for charcoal allocation, an official allotment of Egyptian grain, and an inspected copper plate stamped with the seal of the imperial mint. To produce these dried wheat strands in 16th century Istanbul, a baker could not simply buy flour on the open market. He was forced to purchase grain directly from state-controlled granaries filled by cargo ships arriving from the Nile Delta. The high-protein durum wheat harvested by Egyptian fellahin was seized under quota, loaded onto armed galleys in Alexandria, and funneled straight into the imperial capital under military guard. Every grain had a paper trail. Every pound of flour represented forced agricultural labor and maritime tonnage. At the exact same time, Ottoman forces under Grand Vizier Lala Mustafa Pasha invaded and conquered Cyprus in 1571, seizing control of the island's massive sugar plantations. For the first time, the state held both ends of the supply chain, the high-gluten military wheat from Egypt and the heavy, unrefined sugar produced on Cypriot plantations worked by forced labor. When imperial bakeries combined these two assets, pouring liquid wheat batter onto scorching hot copper plates greased with rendered fat and binding the brittle threads with heavy sugar syrups, they were not creating an indulgence. They were concentrating the physical loot of 2 territorial conquests onto a single brass tray. The dough became a fiscal currency. When you examine these 16th century customs manifests and shipping logs, you realize that every modern commodity carries the fingerprint of an imperial tax collector. The line between what keeps an army moving and what lands on a shelf is far thinner than we like to admit. If you want to keep following these archival investigations into the hidden machinery of what we consume, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. The copper plates themselves were items of strategic military oversight. The raw metal was mined in the mountains of Tokat, smelted in state foundries, and hammered into wide, flat hearth plates designed to retain uniform heat over long hours. The wood required to fuel these hearths was clear-cut from the dense oak forests along the Black Sea coast and shipped south under naval escort. By order of the Grand Vizier, the street inspectors known as the Mutasib walked the alleyways of Istanbul carrying brass calipers, iron weights, and lead seals. They did not check the bakeries for hygiene or taste. They checked for compliance with state-mandated physical dimensions and fuel consumption. The diameter of the brass pouring nozzles was fixed by imperial law, precisely 1 millimeter wide. If a baker crafted the wheat threads too thick, the batter absorbed excess sheep fat, wasting strategic military fuel reserves. If he made them too thin, the threads charred on the hot copper, wasting valuable Egyptian wheat and Black Sea timber. A baker caught using uninspected copper plates or unauthorized charcoal had his iron pans smashed on the cobblestones, his inventory confiscated by janissaries, and his name erased from the guild ledger. The shape of the dough was not an artistic choice, it was a tax bracket. For nearly 300 years, this strict fiscal framework held the supply chains of the Eastern Mediterranean in an iron grip. The state dictated the tonnage of grain shipped from Alexandria, the price of Cypriot sugar, the weight of copper in every pan, and the exact yield of every hearth operating in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia. It was a static, perfectly audited machine of state extraction. But empires do not break from the top down. They shatter along their agricultural borders. By the early 19th century, the centralized power of Istanbul began to rot from within, leaving its richest provinces vulnerable to ambitious military warlords who recognized that controlling the soil was far more valuable than controlling the throne. In 1831, the breakaway governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, shattered his allegiance to the Sultan and dispatched a modern European-trained army led by his son, Ibrahim Pasha. Their objective was not merely political dominance over Syria. It was the total physical conquest of the Levant's agricultural trade routes, specifically the prized, heavily guarded pistachio orchards that ringed the ancient stone walls of Aleppo and Damascus. By May of 1832, the heavy field artillery of Ibrahim Pasha had breached the outer limestone ramparts of Ekr. The coastal fortress was choking under a dense cloud of sulfur, pulverized stone, and burning timber. But while his siege engines dismantled the Ottoman garrison on the coast, Pasha's logistics officers were already operating deep inside the interior, fanning out across the sun-baked plains of Aleppo. They did not carry muskets. They carried ledger books bound in pigskin, brass measuring rods, and armed cavalry escorts. In the military campaign diaries recorded by Pasha's chief quartermaster in the summer of 1832, the instruction was brutal and clear. Every pistachio orchard within a 40-mile radius of Aleppo was declared property of the Egyptian war treasury. Local farmers who had tended these slow-growing, deep-rooted trees for generations were stripped of their land rights overnight. They were forced at gunpoint to harvest the unripened, green-fleshed nuts before the autumn rains, packing them into coarse jute sacks, stamped with the military seal of the Egyptian army. The air in the orchards smelled of crushed resin, hot dust, and black powder. This was not an agricultural harvest. It was a strategic requisition. To understand why an invading army would deploy cavalry to secure thousands of acres of nut trees, you have to look at the financial balance sheets of 19th-century European arms dealers. Ibrahim Pasha was purchasing modern brass field artillery from French foundries in Toulon and thousands of flintlock muskets from British merchants in Liverpool. Those merchants did not accept depreciated Ottoman copper coins or promissory notes. They demanded hard currency, gold bullion, or high-value, non-perishable agricultural commodities that could be liquidated immediately in Marseilles and Trieste. The Aleppo pistachio was the ultimate green currency. Unlike water-heavy soft fruits that rotted within days of picking, the resin-rich nut possessed a unique physiological property. When harvested at peak oil concentration, dried on stone terraces, and ground into a heavy, dense paste using horse-driven granite millstones, it retained its fat without turning rancid for up to 3 years. It was liquid capital in a shell. The Egyptian army transformed the Levant's signature crop into a militarized asset. In the shipping manifests of the port of Beirut from 1833, thousands of iron-hooped barrels containing crushed pistachio oil and high-density paste were logged alongside crates of raw sulfur and lead ingots bound for European ports. Over 42 tons of concentrated nut fat were exported in a single 6-month campaign. The fat of the Levant's orchards was directly traded to fill the ammunition chests of Pasha's infantry. The cost to the local population was catastrophic. By redirecting the entire harvest into military accounts and European export contracts, Pasha created an artificial fat famine across Syria. The local bakeries that had relied on regional nuts to enrich their traditional wheat thread dough were completely cut off from supply. The price of a single oka of Aleppo nuts, roughly 2.5 pounds, rose by 400% in under 12 months. What had once been an accessible regional agricultural yield was overnight transformed into an unreachable luxury, locked behind military cordons and armed checkpoints. Think about the bright green filling sitting inside the chocolate bar on your screen right now. You are trained by social media algorithms to view that vibrant green paste as an indicator of artisan craft, a marker of culinary indulgence, an aesthetic flex engineered for a digital feed. It was born as an asset class forged under heavy artillery fire. The modern luxury status of the Levant pistachio is not a triumph of modern marketing. It is the direct historical legacy of a 19th-century military blockade that deliberately severed an entire region from its own soil to finance a war of expansion. When Pasha's army was eventually forced to retreat by a coalition of European powers in 1841, they did not leave behind thriving agricultural communities. They left behind ruined soil and fractured trade routes. Thousands of ancient trees had been felled for charcoal to heat military camps. The irrigation systems were choked with silt. The families who possessed the generational knowledge to cultivate the delicate, slow-yielding crop were dispersed or forced into military labor. The supply of authentic Syrian pistachios plummeted, while global demand, fueled by the newly industrialized wealthy urban centers of Western Europe, skyrocketed. Scarcity was permanently engineered into the trade. The nut was no longer just an agricultural product. It was a militarized commodity that required vast capital to extract, process, and transport across hostile borders. And as the 19th century drew to a close, this high-density green paste, conquered by siege artillery and audited by imperial officers, was positioned for its final modern convergence. The ancient Syrian war ration, forged in medieval sieges and taxed by Ottoman auditors, was about to meet the global shipping lines of West Africa, where raw cocoa from colonized soil would wrap the Old World's war fuel in a new hyper-profitable skin. In the deep-water ports of Tema and Sekondi, along the coast of Ghana, container ships draft low in the water under the weight of coarse jute sacks filled with unrefined cocoa beans. The shipping manifests crossing the desks of maritime logistics officers in Dubai do not list these harvests as agricultural produce. They list them as raw tonnage entering a multi-billion-dollar processing corridor. The soil of the Gulf of Guinea was cleared through forced colonial concessions in the late 19th century, restructured under European state monopolies and tied directly to international commodity exchanges. Today, millions of smallholder farmers labor under volatile futures contracts set thousands of miles away in London and New York, earning a fraction of a cent on every dollar generated by the final product. When these bulk shipments of West African cocoa arrive at the massive automated processing plants in the industrial zones of Dubai, the raw beans are roasted, ground, and emulsified into uniform milk chocolate coatings. The machinery operates 24 hours a day, stripping away any geographic footprint, reducing decades of soil depletion and human extraction into a smooth, glossy vehicle engineered solely to encapsulate high-value fillings. While cocoa flows through hypermodern maritime trade lanes, the green engine inside that viral bar remains locked in a bloody contemporary war zone. In 2023, along the militarized border dividing northern Syria from southern Turkey, the price for a single metric ton of top-grade Antep and Aleppo pistachio surged past $38,000. That figure was not dictated by boutique pastry shops in London or Paris. It was forged in the crossfire of an active armed conflict. The ancient orchards of Idlib and Aleppo sit directly behind front-line positions controlled by competing armed factions, foreign military outposts, and local warlords. To move a truckload of green nuts out of the combat zone and across the Turkish border requires navigating a gauntlet of illegal toll checkpoints, armed escort fees, and black market currency exchanges. Farmers work their land under the threat of artillery shelling and drone strikes. Armed groups confiscate harvest yields as a tax on territorial control, converting the green-fleshed nuts into operational funding for weapons, fuel, and fighter salaries. The crop is smuggled across mountain tracks at night, packed into hidden compartments under scrap metal and grain bags, before being laundered through regional trading houses with forged certificates of origin. It is not an ingredient. It is a conflict asset. When Sarah Hamouda poured that vibrant pistachio and kadayif, filling inside heavy shells of cocoa in 2021, launching the fixed dessert chocolatier in Dubai, the global algorithm seized on the visual contrast. Social media feeds flooded with videos of users snapping the thick bars in half, captivated by the loud, artificial crunch of toasted wheat threads and the dripping green center. The marketing framed it as a bespoke, artisanal creation, born from a founder's late-night pregnancy craving in a sleek, modern kitchen. The viral phenomenon generated endless digital cues, resale markets where single bars traded for upwards of $100, and thousands of copycat videos produced by creators across the globe. Nobody looked at the ledger. The glossy foil, the hand-painted gold strokes, and the sleek acrylic packaging did not create a new dessert. They built a sterile, high-end camouflage around two of the most violently extracted commodities on Earth. The West African cocoa harvested under severe labor exploitation and the Syrian pistachio smuggled through an active war zone were merged, wrapped in gold leaf, and sold back to the world as an innocent viral trend. The algorithm does not measure human friction, it measures engagement. What you see on your screen is not a modern innovation. It is an optical illusion engineered to separate a consumer from the violent history of their own food, turning a millennium of military logistics and imperial extraction into 15 seconds of digital noise. Listen to that noise. The crisp, amplified crack of a thick chocolate bar snapping open on a smartphone speaker. Millions of views, millions of double taps, a sound precisely engineered to trigger a brief dopamine response in a quiet living room. Now strip away the digital audio filter and listen to what that sound actually is. It is the brittle fracture of high-gluten wheat threads dried on a copper plate in 966 AD. It is the exact acoustic signature made when a Fatimid cavalryman broke off his emergency field ration in the dry wind outside Damascus. It is the crunch of rendered sheep-tail fat, Egyptian grain quotas, and Ottoman brass foundries. When you watch a video of someone peeling back the synthetic gold leaf off an artisanal chocolate bar on your screen, you are looking at a masterclass in historical amnesia. The leaf gold on that bar costs less than 3 cents per sheet. It is a thin layer of vacuum-deposited aluminum and yellow dye designed to mimic the gold bullion that Ibrahim Pasha used to buy European field artillery in 1832. The modern luxury market spent 1,000 years refining the container, while keeping the physical contents virtually identical to the siege rations of the Middle Ages. We like to believe that our food culture is a triumph of human creativity. We convince ourselves that algorithms, social media trends, and boutique kitchens are constantly inventing new ways to delight our palates. It is a comforting lie. The digital feed invents nothing. It simply repurchased the survival mechanisms engineered under military siege. Look at the balance sheet. The high-fat, moisture-resistant matrix, created by Abu Abdallah al-Tamimi, was designed to deliver 3,000 calories to a soldier fighting in heavy-scale armor under a desert sun. Today, that exact same caloric density is sold in a climate-controlled shopping mall in Dubai, encased in cocoa, for a price that could purchase a ton of raw wheat in the Levant. The transformation is total, yet the mechanics remain untouched. The Fatimids calculated the wheat threads in field rations per battalion. The Ottomans calculated them in tax assessments per copper hearth. Modern multinational logistics firms calculate them in container loads, import tariffs, and digital conversion rates. At every stage of human history, the individual consuming this dough was merely the final point of delivery for a far larger, far more ruthless state apparatus. You are not eating an artisan recipe. You are consuming an imperial ledger. Think about the objects sitting on your own kitchen counter right now. The spices in clear glass jars, the coffee beans in vacuum-sealed bags, the sugar dissolving in your cup. You see them as neutral, peaceful ingredients designed for your morning routine. But if you trace the supply line of any one of those items back through the archives, the illusion of innocence instantly collapses. Behind every commodity lies a paper trail of seized land, naval blockades, forced labor quotas, and geopolitical friction. The system relies entirely on your refusal to look backward. It requires you to see only the glossy wrapper, the bright green filling, and the viral video, while remaining completely blind to the centuries of blood and extraction required to bring that object to your table. Every time a new food trend explodes across your feed, the playbook is identical. The origin is stripped clean of its dust and black powder. The human cost in the orchard, in the mine, or along the militarized border is systematically erased. The commodity is sanitized, assigned an aesthetic label, and placed on a shelf with a pristine barcode. It is the ultimate victory of modern consumer capitalism, turning the hard fuel of territorial war and imperial tax extraction into a harmless, 15-second digital spectacle. The bar sitting in a luxury display case in Dubai or landing on a counter in London does not belong to the influencer who promoted it. It belongs to the state archives of Topkapi Palace, the burnt pistachio orchards of Aleppo, and the forced labor cocoa plantations of the West African coast. When we ignore where our food comes from, we do not merely forget history. We become active participants in the illusion that our modern comfort exists in a vacuum. The next time you snap open a bar wrapped in shiny foil, remember, you are not participating in a trend. You are consuming the emergency rations of an empire that bled to keep its cavalry fed. I'm Julian Vance. Until the next ledger.